I'm delighted to say we're joined live from Australia by Daniel Cherny, Chief Cricket Writer at talkSPORT, to talk about the Australian squad. Dan, thanks so much for your time. I suppose the composition of the final 11 was dependent on whether Cameron Green was fit enough to bowl. I see that he has been bowling, or is bowling, for Western Australia against Queensland. So does that mean he'll bat 6 and Marnus will bat at 3? Thanks for your time, by the way. Good to see you.
No, likewise, Manners and Harvey. It's great to be with you. Look, I think you're probably right. It appeared to hinge on whether Cameron Green was going to bowl. He had only bowled 4 overs in competitive cricket in more than 12 months on the back of that back surgery that he had last year, which kept him out of the entire home summer, the Test series against India and Sri Lanka, the IPL as well. And then he was back as a specialist batter in the World Test Championship final, and then against the West Indies. And then he had a little side niggle, so he missed he only bowled in that first Shield game, then didn't play the second, didn't bowl in the third. So it was pretty important that he was going to bowl in this fourth. He has been bowling a lot in the nets, but I suppose there's nothing quite like that match play. But good signs today. He was back bowling, took an early wicket, and it does appear like he will be able to play. Yes, he needs to get through, and this could change. It's only day one of that match. It actually started one day later than the rest of the Shield round, just to give players an extra bit of time to get back from the East Coast if they were playing in the T20 series against India. And also because the first test is in Perth, it didn't need you could have an extra tighter turnaround before the Aussie squad converged. So looking pretty good, which I suppose would be bad news for Bo Webster enthusiasts, given that he'd obviously held down that spot and done a pretty good job, and took a 5 for himself playing for Tassie against South Australia at Bellerive Oval in this Shield round, but has missed out a couple of times with the bat. I think ultimately it wasn't really going to matter. I think they like the idea of a specialist opener in Jake Weatherald, who, as you touched on, has replaced Sam Constas, and Marnus Labuschagne at 3. And they sense, the selectors, that having, and a lot of the senior players as well, I think it's worth noting, prefer the balance of having Labuschagne at 3, and then you have Green at 6 and a specialist opener, which in this case is Jake Weatherald.
Yeah, Osman Khawaja. There's been a lot of talk from, a lot of players have been out and about doing the media rounds. Khawaja mentioned about Labuschagne batting 3, but Dan, no question, Lyon's going to play. I mean, Cameron Green not bowling a huge amount. No Pat Cummins. Are they worried about being short on sort of seamer overs, with it being an Optus and the ball flying through? Are they going to play an all-seam attack, or is Lyon definitely going to play?
Look, I'd be very surprised if Lyon didn't play, Harmy. I know, look, it's only Australia's most recent test that he didn't play, so it's not beyond the realms of possibility. And, they've shown now that they are willing to do it. And I suppose to a degree, Nathan Lyon, for the rest of his Test career, will probably be looking a little bit over his shoulder, certainly in any seam-friendly conditions, because, as I said, they have been willing to do it. I think it would have been a different conversation, perhaps, if Pat Cummins was fit, whether they'd potentially have gone in with the 4 frontline seamers. But I just get the sense that 3 frontline seamers plus 2 all-rounders does not necessarily equal 4 frontline quicks. I think, that would be a bit of a bits and pieces attack, potentially leaves you vulnerable. Look, there's risk either way to a degree. Nathan Lyon had not had an outstanding start to the Shield season. Did take 4 wickets, though, in the first innings for New South Wales against Victoria on day 1 of that match. New South Wales actually fell on the heap today with the bat. Only Steve Smith really made runs for them, as Victoria continuing their very good start to the season. But no, look, I'd be surprised. The only time Australia's played that sort of composition was actually at the Manchester Test in 2023. Of course, Lyon was injured by that point of the Ashes, and Todd Murphy had played the 3rd Test, then got dropped. They played Green and Mitch Marsh together as sort of a combined 4th bowler, and it didn't really work. So I'd be very surprised if they went that way. I think they're going to back the frontline quicks to get the job done. And Nathan Lyon, despite maybe it not appearing like that would be the case at face value, does have a very good record in Perth, where his he can extract a fair bit from the bounce. So I think he will play, yes.
Dan, Steve Waugh doesn't say much these days, but when he does talk, it's usually it usually makes an impact. He said that there were some tough decisions to make selection-wise, and he didn't think that George Bailey had shown much appetite to make tough decisions. Let's just hear Bailey's response to that.
We're aware of the age profile of the team. I'm interested when people sort of have that view as to who would they like us to leave Nathan Lyon and Mitch Starc out? Is it just because of their age, or is that? But I think there's other ways of attacking that. Again, we're investing heavily into Australia A cricket. We're rolling some young guys through. There's been debuts. There's been people on tours. That will happen, but I think you have to have respect for the fact that these guys work incredibly hard to play Test cricket. We see it as still the sort of pinnacle format, and so I think you've got to give due respect that the guys are performing very well, and they earn the right to be selected. But no, I'm not sure the players pick it. I'm sure there'd be more names on that list if the players were able to pick it.
That's Australia's Chief Selector George Bailey responding with some degree of, I think, whimsy to Steve Waugh's comments. Dan, I mean, just on a wider picture, I mean, I'm interested in your take on the age thing as well. And, you know, I mean, Bailey makes a very good point. What does he want me to do? Drop Mitchell Starc and Nathan Lyon because they're 35 or 38? But it ties into a real eyebrow-raising piece that you wrote a couple of days ago, in which you said that as many as half of the nationally contracted players would be prepared not to be contracted to Cricket Australia, you know, in order to have freedom and play franchise cricket. Now, did you put a bit of topspin on that? Or, I mean, because otherwise it doesn't look good for Australian cricket.
I'm not sure who's put the topspin there. Look, the story came from the ACA, Australian Cricketers Association's annual report, in which they outlined some highlights from a player survey which they'd done across certainly across selection. I imagine all would have been asked of contracted players. That's nationally, state, and either BBL or WBL. So this is across men and women, nationally and state contracted players, and BBL contracted players. And the stat was 34% of players would consider going, you know, turning down, foregoing a state or franchise or BBL or national contract to go on, I suppose, the franchise circuit, the global circuit. Now, that's actually, in some respects, and, you know, obviously, Manners, you know this all too well from what South Africa's been through. We know New Zealand and the West Indies has been very well documented over the years. It's actually lower than the global, the World Cricket Association did a poll last year. I think the number was 60%, or asked a similar question. But that's one thing for globally when you're looking at, you know, players from all manner of nations, some not even necessarily test nations, that you know, whether they would do it. I mean, I understand if someone from Scotland or Afghanistan is weighing that up, but when it's Australia, where it's got obviously a historically very robust state and big bash contract system, and this is at a time when there's a big discussion about the privatisation of the Big Bash League going on. It is a concern. I think it has to be a concern. The current pay deal, memorandum of understanding between CA and the ACA, still has a couple of years to run, doesn't expire till 2028. But it's a rapidly changing time in cricket. There's so many moving parts. And I mean, we're already seeing it to a degree, because you look at Australia's men's T20 11, and two of the best, you know, two of the linchpins of that team at the moment are Tim David and Marcus Stoinis, neither of whom certainly didn't accept central contracts to start with, or weren't necessarily even offered central contracts to start with. They're both going to get upgrades with the system here. If you play a certain amount of games, you trigger a full contract, which they have both now done. But yeah, it's certainly obviously this is a big talking point and a big watch this space across international cricket. And the fact that it is now, you know, this phenomenon is reaching Australian shores is one that is a concern for the Australian game.
Yeah, I agree, and I think I've said this on this show, Dan, many times, that I think this Ashes could be a turning point for England to be like that. If Australia win, McCullum and Stokes end up either losing their jobs, or if it goes sort of badly for England, then all of a sudden, where's the pull for the England team to sort of turn down franchise gigs if they're going to, you know, these Indian franchise owners go and get teams from all over the world in the competitions and start contracting individual players. And I think that might happen as early as once this Ashes series is finished. So I think we are at a tipping point especially the Test match game, to where the Test match future holds. I think the shortest format of game, I think England, Australia and their players will still hopefully be available for world tournaments. But I think going back to this Ashes, Pat Cummins, is he on track for that second Test match? Because there's a lot of talk of him being on that. Because I think certainly my opinion is, whoever gets off to a good start in Perth, all of a sudden Brisbane could be toss of a coin. You get the luck your way, you could be 2-0 up in 2 Test matches, and that pretty much is the Ashes over for whoever's 2-0 down.
Yeah, obviously historically a very long way back from 2-0. I mean, it's been doing some pre-series previews and various pieces, and that famous stat about only one Test series in history as a team come back from 2-0 down to win back in the 36-37 Ashes, and they did have the advantage of a guy named Don Bradman. Yeah, no, it's and Cummins, as good as he is not Bradman, but look, whether he plays in the second Test, I think the jury's still out. They're certainly leaving the door ajar there, and he has been back bowling in Sydney, which is clearly very promising for the Australian team. I don't know. It's a bit of a, it's the rumour mill and the whispers at the moment that are doing the rounds. The sense tends to be that the third and fifth might be more likely. I mean, he himself has now cast doubt as to whether he could play back-to-back Tests in this series. Now, there are relatively sizable gaps between each of the first 4 Tests, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and 3 to 4. 4 to 5, Melbourne, Sydney is the tightest backup, and you'd imagine it'll be a struggle there. And that may well be a situation where, say, you try to get Scott Boland up for Melbourne. Obviously, I mean, he's got a very good record everywhere in Australia, really. But he on his home deck at the MCG, and then maybe Cummins plays in Adelaide and then in Sydney. So I think there has to be some doubts. I did an interview with Peter Siddle a week or 2 back, and he certainly said, look, he urged Cummins to be really cautious there. He remembers going in out. Peter Siddle, great bowler himself, not quite to Pat Cummins' level, but more than 200 Test wickets for Australia shouldn't be sneezed at either. And he was talking about going into, I think it was the 2016-17 season when South Africa were out here and won that series manners, and he had a back issue which had ruled him out of the back end of the previous season. He tried to get himself up, played the first Test, and then didn't play another Test for 2 years, almost 2 years. So as good as Pat Cummins is, and as big as the Ashes is, and it is the biggest series on the calendar, a home Ashes series, I think it's hard to disagree with that. You still got to play the long game, because Pat Cummins is 32, and I mean, who knows what the future of international cricket is. And maybe we're talking about IPL campaigns going down the track, but it's ultimately you've got to make sure that Pat Cummins is taken care of in the long run, because it's just not worth it.
Dan, just very quickly, I've got to ask you about Jake Weatherald and the overall perspective of Australian batting. Now, he's got a first-class average of 37, and when Harmy was playing, that wouldn't have been good enough to keep you in the state team, never mind national selection. There is I'll also never forget the intimidation factor that South African and English teams felt coming up against an Australian top 6, all of whom averaged over 50 in Test cricket at one point. I'll never forget, South Africa didn't have a single player averaging over 40, and averages are one way to measure, but I mean that South African team were half beaten before they walked onto the field. But there is a perception that Australian cricket, batting in particular, isn't quite what it used to be. There's been a sort of a decline. Is that a simplistic view?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think certainly the numbers are down. Now the question is, what is the reason for that? And I think there are multiple reasons. I think it's hard to argue that the pitches in Sheffield Shield cricket and in the Test cricket in Australia in the last few years have been harder to play on. The changes to the Kookaburra ball with the reinforced seam and the lacquer changes, without getting overly technical, I believe have made the game tough, harder, particularly against the new ball. I give the example of someone like a Fergus O'Neill you look at it from a bowling perspective. Now, Fergus O'Neill, who bowls in the probably low 120 kilometres an hour, has an exceptional record in first-class cricket, both for Australia, for Nottinghamshire, and for Australia A. I think he averages this is a 21 or so. Now, is he in the same calibre of bowler as, say, someone who was towards the top of the Sheffield Shield bowling charts 20 years ago, when teams were routinely piling on 300, 400 consistently, someone like an Ashley Noffke as an example? Possibly not. I don't think he's that much better than someone like that per se. So I think you have to take it with a bit of a grain of salt. The numbers, I think it's a tougher batting era. So you look at someone like a Jake Weatherald. I mean, actually, Marcus Harris is a really interesting example. Now, he's probably played his last Test for Australia. He didn't do very well in Test cricket overall. Had a few handy knocks without ever quite bedding down his spot. I had a look at the stat recently. I think he was averaging 37 or 38 across his first class career when opening, and he's had a handful of innings now across both county cricket and for Victoria, batting between 4 and 6, and he's averaging 64 in the middle order. And I think it just shows that it is being a new ball batsman in Australia in first class cricket is tough work. Jake Weatherald's had a very interesting career. Has had some real ups and downs, peaks and troughs. Moved states. Has been very open about his mental health struggles. And very bravely spoken about that. I mean, you talk about not getting a game for your state. It wasn't very long ago he wasn't getting a game for his state. We're talking, 18 months ago, he couldn't get a game for Tasmania. Wanted to try to move to Victoria after just 1 year in Tasmania. They wouldn't let him go because he was contracted. So I think it's an interesting talking point. I think what you'd say is globally, that these guys are still, broadly speaking, making runs when they go overseas, not necessarily en masse, but it's not, they went to Sri Lanka and they piled on runs. So I think it's probably more to do with Australian conditions than a massive batting malaise, but the proof will be in the pudding with the next generation. I mean, it's one thing for Steve Smith to go to Sri Lanka and make runs, or Usman Khawaja, but if the next generation, if someone like an Ollie Peake who's coming through at 19, or a Sam Constas, or even Cameron Green, who's now been in the Test side for 5-6 years, in his mid-20s, unless he can consistently do it overseas, then I think at that point you'll be able to say, no, there is actually a deeper issue, and one which Australian cricket needs to confront.
Finally, Dan, in 10 seconds, you'd be silly enough to give us a prediction.
I would be silly enough. 4-1 Australia. I think England will win one, but I do think that Australia's fast bowling, even without Cummins, will just be too much for England, just with the ball moving around.